Ooh, moment of truth. Moment of truth. Is this working? Oh, yay, that one's working. Can you all hear me? Ooh. Oh, this is terrifying. Utterly terrifying. Hello. God. Great. I'm going to take that people can hear me. That's good. Legend. This is honestly one of the most terrifying things I've ever done in my life. Someone on Facebook asking after our dog. Millie's doing well, Wilma. Okay, it's time. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Karen. I won't panic too much. Hi, I'm Nick. I'm the head of theatre at the Pleasance. And a big thank you to the King's Head for inviting me to take part. These sessions have been really great, and I've kind of tuned in when I can. And if you haven't checked them out, there's a whole bunch of really good sessions on everything from kind of designing posters, photography, working as an associate director, working in Europe. So I'd highly recommend going back. I think they're on the King's Head blog and also on their Facebook page. So do go and check some more out. So I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about programming festivals, but it might be useful if I just kind of tell you a little bit about kind of the Pleasance and what I do in my job role. So I'm the head of theatre at the Pleasance, which means that I oversee our theatre programming. My mum's come online from Australia, which is also freaking me out even more. So I oversee our theatre programming, which is quite a wide remit in that I look after all of our theatre and performance, which includes children's work and family work, but excludes our comedy programming across 2 different sites. So we have 3 spaces in London, which is a 250-seat main house, a 80-seat studio, and then a 55-seat comedy/work in progress space, which we program all year round in Islington. It's about kind of a 15-minute walk from the King's Head. But we also, and where I'm going to primarily focus kind of the talk here is on our programming at Edinburgh Fringe every year, which I think is what we're kind of best known for. So I'm going to kind of primarily focus on thinking behind how we program in Edinburgh. A lot of this is transferable. So if you have specific questions about programming in London, off West End, tour booking around the UK, then do ask those questions in the Instagram over here and in the Facebook down here, and I'll try and come to those questions as and when I can. I'm also going to drop into, if I can do it, I don't know if I can, or I might do it at the end, I'll drop in, lovely, to the Facebook, some other links to different kind of resources you may want to look at specifically if you're interested in kind of either getting your work into venues in London, but also kind of around the UK or going on tours. So one of them is the Stamp Network, which is a network the Pleasance is part of and the King's Head's a part of, which is a collection of kind of venues and organisations in London that run artist development programmes, most of which, or a lot of which, you have venues and programme work. So I put their link in there and it's stamplondon.org. Similarly, if you're looking at seeing work around the country, the 2 sites I'd really kind of encourage you to look at is venues in the north, so I'm going to pop that in the Facebook chat, as well as House Theatre, which look at the southeast of England and connect kind of venues and have a lot of really good kind of resources on programming and touring there. Well, a website called Black Theatre Live, which was primarily set up to support the touring of work made and led by artists of colour, but also an amazing kind of venue map for the UK. And if you're looking at kind of programming or touring, it's a really easy way to kind of put one venue in and then see what other venues are around you might be able to tour to, and has a bit of information and contact information on how to get in touch with those. Then so we use Black Theatre Live a lot when we're helping to organise tours, because it's just a really great website to go to and be able to find lots of different venues. So I've raced through that first section. Excellent. So programming. I guess it's really useful to say kind of from the outset that there is no one program, and what I'm talking about here is going to be my opinions in a lot, because there is no real kind of hard and fast rule about how venues program, and to say that even every venue at the Fringe programs in a completely different way. Each member of our team programs in a different way, but we do all follow some kind of guiding principles, and there are some general ways and kind of thought patterns that we go through in order to kind of program our work. So I think it's useful to talk a little bit about kind of what the Pleasance's guiding principles are. So there's kind of three main guiding principles to our Edinburgh programming, which also kind of transfers over to our London programming as well. And the first one is that the best newcomers and emerging talent sit side by side with the leaders in their field from the UK and internationally. And that's kind of something that ever since the Pleasance began has been a core part of what we do in Edinburgh. Is you're as likely to see a newcomer as you are to see a top comedian. You're as likely to see a company doing their first show as you are to see companies that are touring all around the world. And getting that balance right across our program is always a challenge, but it's kind of part of the exciting part of the program. And looking for links between companies that are kind of at the early stage of their career and in the same program, and having a company that might be 5 years or 10 years further down the line. Second kind of our broad principles is that we're focused on telling new stories and discovering new voices. So that implies in and of itself a focus on new writing in a really broad sense, but that also includes a real focus on company and device theatre making. I guess the kind of what's behind that principles that Pleasance as an organisation is interested in stories. So our methodology looks at what the show is trying to say and what the story is, then also looks at things like form, company style, etc. But that we're primarily looking for new voices and new stories. And the third guiding principle is that we are looking for work that is popular. And popular is not a dirty word. I'm talking to a lot of artists. The idea, I think, of something being popular seems kind of in opposition to it being artistic or being risky. But popular just means that people want to see it. And ideally, lots of people want to see it. And I think anyone making art and making theatre and specifically needs to be thinking really early about who's the audience, who's it for, how big's that audience, what's the potential scale and reach of the show. There was a really interesting article that was put out on Broadway World, I think a couple of days ago, which was an interview with Nikolai Foster and Chris Stafford, who are the artistic director and executive director of Leicester Curve. And they go into kind of a bit of detail about their responses to kind of what is perceived as a tension between programming kind of risky artistic work and programming popular or broad appeal work. So I'd really kind of encourage you to check out that interview, and kind of I think their thinking is really kind of sound about that when we're trying to grow audiences, bring new people into the theatre, that actually popular is not the opposite of art, and that actually finding something that can speak to a really broad audience or just knows who its audience is and knows how to reach that audience is really, really important. One of the big kind of frustrations that I get a lot when I'm going through programming applications is we have a question in there that says, who is this for? Who's the audience? And I'd say 70% of the companies say that their show's for everyone, and nothing is for everyone. And if there's one thing that kind of anyone can take out of this talk, whether you're making work or running venues or just like to go to the theatre, is to kind of have a think about what the audience is for a certain show, what the audience you're making for, what the work you're attracted to going and seeing is. So I think the more that we start to root our practice in, as specifically as makers and as venues, in being responsive to who the audience for the work is, I think the easier it then becomes to be able to have successful shows. So I think it's disingenuous to program work, especially in a model like Edinburgh Fringe, which is so expensive, where you don't think there is an audience for that show, or we don't currently have that audience for the show. Because it costs a lot of money, and that ultimately, I think you're then giving artists, I think it's just unethical in a lot of ways to program shows where you don't think that they can get a minimum financial return on the investment they're putting into either staging the show or bringing it to Edinburgh. So I'm also just going to drop Nikolai and Chris article into the King's Head Facebook page, but you can find that on Broadway World. It's a really good read. I'm going to get straight to kind of, I think, one of the key differences in our approach as a festival, specifically to how we would tend to program as a venue, or how other venues program, and that is that we go to the audience first. But to kind of explain why we do that, I think it's useful to go into a little bit about the scale of the Pleasance in Edinburgh. The scale really informs why we have an audience-focused programming approach. So it's just kind of a little bit of kind of context. So at the 2019 Fringe, we sold over 560,000 tickets. So that was to 5,534 performances of 277 productions. That's across 3 main hubs. So we operate at Pleasance Courtyard, our original kind of venue and hub, and there's about 15 venues there. Then we also have Pleasance Dome, and there is 6, maybe 7 venues there. We also have the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, where we have 1, 2, 3, I think it's about 4, and potentially some pop-up venues there. but it gives us, and we also take pop-up venues. So they might be, we had a small shed in the courtyard of programmed and supported shows that were on in a flat on the other side of Edinburgh. Swimming pools, kind of anywhere else around the city. But on average, that gives us usually about 28 venues per year at the Fringe, and they range in size from 1,500 seats being our biggest venue, which is the EICC, to 48 seats, which is our smallest venue in the courtyard. But what that means is that we're looking for work on a range of scales, and by a range of scales, we mean that can sell a really wide range of tickets, ticket numbers. So in order to be able to kind of fill those venues and make sure that the companies are able to make the most out of that opportunity, we need to be thinking really early on about who is the audience for this show. We also think about audience in a really kind of wide way. So it's not just about kind of demographic breakdowns. So whilst kind of age, gender, ethnicity, whether the sexual orientation of audience members, gender identity of audience members are all factors, we try and look in a slightly more wider framework. And at the same time, we're also looking for shows that will speak to multiple audiences. So I thought it might be useful just to run through how we break down audience groups. So we are looking across age, and we're looking for children and families work. So we've got a really large children and family program at Edinburgh every year. So I think last year we sold about 60,000 tickets to children and family shows. But we're quite specific when we're looking at children and families work as well. It's not one group. We're always looking for shows for under twos, for babies in arms, because there's a huge audience in Edinburgh for that. There's a huge audience across the country, and there's not a lot of work being made for that age group. It's also an age group that allows you to operate outside of school holiday time. So the Fringe runs through school holidays, but there's the last week of the Fringe that's usually not in school holiday time. So if we can get a high quality work for under twos, we know that we can still consistently sell tickets right throughout that festival. And then we tend to break up our children and families work into then two other broader groups. So we're then usually looking for work that's 3 to 5s or 3 to 6 year old. Again, that's so that that work will extend across the school holidays. But also there's a really different kind of approach to storytelling and structure and form that goes into work for 3 to 5s. And then we tend to kind of look for mixed family work as kind of the next age group up. Because we know that lots of families will come to the Fringe and they'll have children of all different ages. So for families with young children, we're quite specific about babies in arms and 3 to 5s, but then for families that have children on a wide age spectrum, we're then looking kind of family work. A question I get asked a lot is, do we program work for teenagers? And we don't specifically look for work for teenagers. And that's because in kind of our experience, teenagers just want to see work that everyone else is seeing, and don't tend to be going to the Fringe on their own. They tend to be coming with their families, or they're really actively interested in theatre and tend to be looking for work that's in our, that's not directly in our kind of children and families program. We then tend to look for kind of we do look at demographics. So there are some kind of clear age bands that make up our audience. So like 20 to 30 year olds is one clear age band. Interestingly, that's predominantly made up of other artists performing at the Fringe. So when we're looking at work for kind of 20 to 30 year olds, we're also looking for work that is of the interest to people that are theatre makers or studying theatre or wanting to kind of be involved in the Fringe in future years. We then have kind of a 30 to 50s age band who are looking for basically a good night out. A large chunk of our comedy audience sits in that 30 to 50 age band. A lot of that audience age band is local. So about 40% of our audience in Edinburgh is from Edinburgh, and a lot of that audience sits in that 30 to 50 age bracket. And then we are looking for kind of a work that for audiences that are 50 to 70 plus. A lot of those audiences travel, and they've been to the Fringe for a long time, so they know specifically what they want. So we're not often programming work for those audiences based on their age demographic. We're programming them based on other kind of criteria that I'll get to in a moment. The other is kind of a representation of form across the program. So that's in a really broad sense. So we're looking for work that speaks to dance, physical theatre, circus, cabaret, new plays, experimental types of theatre, improv, all types of comedy, musicals, and in different kind of ratios of work. So we do program dance work. It's not the major part of our program. But one of the kind of beautiful things about Edinburgh as well is there are lots of venues, and lots of those venues have specialisms, and they have audiences looking specifically for that work. So we will program large-scale commercial dance, and we will program dance that is kind of playing with forms. It might be dance with theatre, or dance with circus, or dance with cabaret. Similarly in circus and cabaret, we have a big circus program, but it's specifically kind of large-scale shows at the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, and that is primarily because most of our venues don't have the capability to kind of the ring points to deliver a lot of other circus, and there are other venues that have the capabilities to do that. So Circus Hub that Underbelly run, Assembly always have a great kind of circus and cabaret program at George Square. So it's an area that whilst we do have some of that work in our program, it's not necessarily something we're strictly looking for. But if the right work comes across and fits in our venues and we think we have an audience for it, we will program it. The next kind of thing we're then kind of looking at is we're looking at kind of themes and subject matter. So there are certain types of shows that are really popular, and we were always looking for shows in this vein. So we're always looking for biopic shows. So that might be a Buster Keaton show, an Einstein show, a Greta Garbo show that is about the life of or of a famous person, as they sell really well. We're also looking for shows specifically. We always seem to be looking for shows about World War I and World War II. They always do really well across different types of age ranges as well. We're always looking for shows then on kind of specific that talk to specific experiences. So that might be shows that talk to specific experiences around race, around gender, might be LGBTQ plus issues, it might be around children and families. I'm just going to slightly segue here, and because often when we're talking about themes and subject matter, people talk a lot about, and rightly so, that there's a lot of work at Edinburgh Fringe that's around mental health. We don't specifically look for work around themes of mental health. And that's because in my experience so far, I'm yet to find an audience member that doesn't have kind of an academic or a professional interest in mental health that's desperately going to the theatre to watch 4 shows a day about mental health. And kind of the analogy that I kind of make with companies is that great work that references and speaks to mental health is not usually specifically about mental health. There are, of course, examples, but Hamlet didn't write a play, Shakespeare didn't write a play about mental health. He wrote Hamlet, kind of about the power struggle between a family. And we can now read into that in a variety of different ways. Which kind of leads on to kind of the next part here, is that we're also never looking at shows that are just referencing one audience demographic. So the most successful shows that we program can speak to a different age demographic. They might play with form. They might be looking at a different subject matter and combined together. Because going back to the point I was making earlier about artists saying that their shows for everyone, I think the best kind of advice and the top tip I give to people when they're looking to apply to our program or are looking to be programmed in other venues is to think about their audiences in 3 groups. So to think about who's the primary audience for your show, who's the secondary audience for your show, and who's the tertiary audience for your show. And I'll use an example. So I'm always looking for shows about cycling, because it's really easy to market a show in a 50-seater to cycling, because you can go straight to cycling clubs in Edinburgh or anyone that knows or anyone who likes cycling and say, here's a show about cycling, you might be interested in that. That's a really easy way to sell 50 seats. If we want that show then to be selling 100 seats, 200 seats, then I'm looking for it to be drawing from different audiences. So for example, the show I haven't yet had come into our inbox, but if it did, I'd almost program it in an instant, would be a show about cycling, a biopic about Bradley Wiggins that is playing with form, so it might be delivered as circus. So then that one show, I've got 3 really clear audience groups that I can market to, and then I'm programming based on. So I'm programming on issue, which is programmed on kind of a theme, which is cycling. It's also a biopic, so I can sell to that audience, and it's also playing with form because it's a circus show. And I think a lot of the really successful work that moves, that moves from smaller scale venues and makes a journey up to larger scale work is because it's clear on its audiences, and it has 3 of those. And some people saying I would definitely go to see a Bradley Wiggins biopic all about cycling, where all the cycles are like hung from rigging in the sky and there's aerialists kind of doing the cycling upside down. That sounds amazing. So if you're making work, so that's an artist, what I'd really suggest doing is at a really early stage, think about who the work is for, and trying to even break that out quite specifically into who's the primary audience, who's the secondary audience, and who's the tertiary audience for that work. And then when you're engaging with kind of festivals or programmers, to speak to them quite clearly about those audiences and not be afraid. I keep saying to artists that have a clear primary, secondary, and tertiary audience, and hopefully other people come. Just assume that everyone will come outside of that, that it's really easy to then produce your show and to market your show once you've, from the outset, been quite clear about who you're making your show for. So then we get to this question of quality. because there still needs to be a decision made about whether that show is good in essence, and good is such a subjective term. Everyone has a really different idea about what that means. So we kind of approach quality using the audience metrics that we've kind of discussed before. So and to say, like, from the outset, that we're constantly programming work that is not particularly my cup of tea, and that's because we're programming for like 600,000 ticket sales, and there's not 600,000 ticket sales that just want to see the kind of theatre that I want to go and see. So we're thinking through an application when we receive it, or a show when we're watching it, going, okay, who, and is this show the best example of work that we could put in front of that audience? And we're then thinking that way about going, okay, is it interesting in form? Is it doing what it sets out to do? So if it's a biopic about Bradley Wiggins, is it telling you the story of Bradley Wiggins and doing it in an interesting way that could be exciting for an audience to see? And then that is kind of the metric we use to kind of judge the quality of that work. Because there's lots of like World War II shows. We have another kind of example of a show that uses kind of multiple audience hooks in a really interesting way is David William Bryan, who's a solo theatre maker, has a show called In Loyal Company that keeps coming back to our venue because it's a really excellent one-man show of a personal story of his uncle's experience in World War II. But his secondary audience is he's very active in kind of encouraging other theatre makers and teaching other theatre makers how to make solo work. So his three audiences are people interested in World War II, people are interested in kind of historical family stories, true stories, and his third audience is people that are interested in making solo work. So he's speaking to artists, to that 20 to 30s group, as well as to other age brackets and other interest groups as well. Unfortunately, once we get through programming, that's only kind of half our job at the Fringe. The more difficult part is actually scheduling shows. So for those who haven't been to Edinburgh, we run 12 to 16-hour days in our venues with up to kind of 11 shows, 12 shows in every venue every day. So we'll start shows kind of 10 a.m. in the morning, and our last shows, in some venues will go up at 1 a.m. in the morning. So where shows sit in days is almost as important in the programming process as finding the shows in the first instance. And a general rule, we kind of break our day into kind of morning, which is kind of 10 till 12. We do a lot of children and families work, and it's very broad. Then kind of 12 through till 4, it's kind of peak theatre time. 5 and 6 is this weird crossover time where between kind of theatre and comedy, so a lot of improv, a lot of goes in there, a lot of showstoppers, a lot of kind of Murder She Didn't Write tends to sit in that time slot. And then from kind of 7 till 10 o'clock, it's kind of peak comedy time. But that's not a strict rule. We've had a lot of really successful theatre work that plays early in the morning. We've had a lot of really successful theatre work that plays really late. And I think at that point it might be useful to kind of give 2 examples. So I think Michelle Barnett's on here, and she produced an amazing musical called Sparks, which we programmed 100-seater at 11 a.m. in the morning, which meant it was before the rush of theatre, but it had kind of it included music. I call them like hangover ugly cry shows. So if you can go to the show with a bit of a hangover, feel kind of emotionally been on a journey, and have a like happy ugly cry before you go back out to watch for the rest of your day, then they're often really good early morning shows. Or if they've got a kind of sense of whimsy. So another show that's played early that did really well was a show called Finding Fassbender, which was about a character who moved into a house that Michael Fassbender used to live in, and she used to receive all of Michael Fassbender's mail. So she was trying to find Michael Fassbender to give him the mail. It was really kind of sweet and whimsical, and it kind of ticked the list if you could go see it. It was really high quality work, really well done, that you could go with a hangover. Similarly, in late night, finding theatre work that can play like post 11 o'clock is tricky. And again, it's looking for a really good story that works in that time. So 2 kind of good examples from recent years is last year we had a company called In Bed With My Brother, which are often very form-pushing kind of shows and experimental in their nature. But this had a really clear story, and that was about how the economics of the Fringe don't work, but was delivered in a real kind of punk rock, raucous kind of presentation style. We played that at 11 weeks and sold out just about every ticket because it was a great way to kind of end your evening if you're a theatre fan and don't really want to go to a comedy show. And similarly, we also had another show which was by a maker called Paul O'Donnell, and it was We've Got Each Other, which was a completely imaginary John Bon Jovi musical. So it was just Paul standing on stage, playing this video. I've lost something over here. I don't know what that is. Hold fire there on Instagram. I seem to have lost Facebook. happened, didn't we? If there's anyone on the Facebook, is it on the Facebook? Gosh, becoming my mum because she's watching. If I'm still playing there, let me know. I don't think I am. So for the lovely people at on Instagram, then I will carry on. Was Paul O'Donnell's show, which was an entirely imagined John Bon Jovi musical. So it kind of got people in on the fact they thought they were coming to see a John Bon Jovi musical, but it was Paul talking through a musical he didn't have the money to make. So it's kind of this meta-theatrical exploration of what is a musical. But because Paul's kind of performance style allowed him to be able to react to the varying levels of inebriation that an audience at 11 o'clock at a festival brings. And so that was a really kind of successful example of a show there. And we always have to bear in mind that theatre audiences don't just come out during the day. Comedy audiences don't just come out at night. So increasingly we have comedy programming now happening in the late afternoon. We've had some comedy program really early. Work drop sometimes they're great, so the Facebook is still working good. So we have comedy programming that will still run throughout the day, and we have theatre programming that will still run throughout the day. And similarly, we also have kids programming, because there was a year where all our kind of family programming finished at 12, and we know that families don't suddenly disappear at 12, they want to stay have all day, so we do try and seed some of our family programming later through the program. So when we're kind of doing the physical programming process and the physical scheduling process, the thing that we're trying to achieve is this idea of pathways through our program, so that any audience member can attend the Fringe, come to the Pleasance, and ideally spend the entire day in our venues, following different pathways, either by interest, or what their form, that allow them to see different work up to kind of 8 to 10 shows at the same time. So we're always looking at this idea of what is an audience pathway through our program. Do we have any questions at this point? So I feel like I've just rambled a lot. Thanks, Mom. No questions. So I wanted to kind of touch on a response that I know a lot of venues, and I've heard other also Edinburgh venues, have made to artists, which is, so I've been talking a lot about our programming approach being audience focused and audience centric. And so the response that I know I've definitely got back from venues, and I'm sure lots of people that are kind of watching have got back from venues, is that we don't have the audience for that response. And to say that most times when a venue or a festival says to you they don't have the audience for it, I tend to believe that that's true, but it usually means that they don't have the audience for it, not that the audience doesn't exist. In Edinburgh, I think it's really interesting that you've got a lot of different venues. So if it's a really experimental piece of theatre that's really playing with form and is kind of more about a mood, emotion, than it is necessarily about strict narrative, then it's not usually the right show for us. And I would say I don't have the audience for that. The venues like Summerhall do, venues like Zoo do. And in that instance, it's just finding the right venue to take that piece of work to. So when, I think it's always worth asking your venue or your festival, what is their audience? What kind of work are they looking for? We have some questions on Instagram. What do you want to see more of at the Fringe? From Michelle. I want to see more Bradley Wiggins circus shows, is the first thing I'd like to see. I'd like to see more work led by artists of colour. And that kind of comes back to that we don't have the audience. I know a company that was told by a venue, who was a company led by artists of colour, that there isn't an audience for that work at the Fringe, which is categorically untrue. It's just that that venue does not have that audience. The bigger issue actually at the Fringe is that organisations, venues, ourselves included, are not reaching out to artists and getting the applications in because the artists that we're trying to, the artists of colour, feel kind of put off by the programming at the Fringe. That's a responsibility on us to change the way we engage with artists and the way that we program and how we support work made by artists of colour to ensure that the best work's getting to our stages, because when it does, we sell bucket loads of tickets. So we awarded our Charlie Harthill, which is kind of our lead kind of new play award, to a company called Strictly Arts from Coventry, who did a show called Freeman. We put it into a 180 seat venue and it sold out every single ticket for 27 days. So, and that was a really mixed audience, but it was a very diverse audience. So this argument that there isn't an audience for kind of work led or made by artists of colour at the Fringe is categorically untrue. It's just that the venues saying that do not have that audience. and the requirement should be on the venues to do so. So one of the things that's really sad about the Fringe being suspended this year is that we'd launched a new development fund for Artists of Colour to bring, it was going to be 2 pieces of work, one at kind of a really large scale, so about 200 seats, and one at a kind of small studio scale, so about 60 seats, into the program, because we know we have the audience. We just needed to be more proactive in how we got the work in and how we supported that work to get to the Fringe. Ooh, a few more questions. Do you think there'll be much of a change in what audiences and venues want after COVID-19, or do you think that people are getting back to normal? I've been hearing people are going to want feel-good stuff. That is a really good question, and I don't think any of us really know that answer yet. I think there was already a bit of a feeling. I've been talking with a couple of other programmers just kind of on the side, really, about what our future programming might look like regardless. I'm really keen to see a venue do a whole season full of, sorry, our dog's just come on, Millie. Do you want to come say hi? Come say hi? She's not keen. About a whole season of rom-coms. I think that'd be lovely. The reason that comedies are always gold dust as well. Every venue, every festival is always looking to find a good comedy, because writing a good comedy is really hard. Writing jokes that people find funny that work in a kind of dramatic framework is really difficult to do. But do I think fundamentally the work that people are looking for will change? I don't know, but I don't think so. What are the 3 shows that are pitched to you endlessly? In application forms, if I read the sentence, did you know that 1 in 4, any statistic about mental health at the beginning of a Fringe application? I think yes, we do know. I've been to theatre and I've read marketing copy now. I know that mental health is a huge issue in society. And I think kind of just resting, that's kind of why I brought up mental health specifically in the kind of themes and issues section, is that I think theatre makers have got really good at writing funding applications, but have got, it's meant that their marketing copy writing skills are not as good. So that the marketing copy we're being presented with reads like a funding bid and talks about the issues and themes of the work, but not actually the story of the work. What other shows do I wish I didn't see? Ironically, I say this flippantly, I really don't like one-person shows, and the irony of that kind of programming, one of the larger venue at probably the world's largest festival of one-person shows, is not lost, but it's because making a good one-person show is really hard. To kind of justify an audience's attention for an hour, the writing has to be excellent, and the performance also has to be excellent. So I spend a lot of time speaking to artists, and I know that a lot of time the one-person show sometimes feels like artists are doing it as an economic choice rather than an artistic choice. And I completely understand that, because it's really expensive to produce, especially at the Fringe where there is no real state subsidy. But my question always back is the one-person show serving your story? And if not, let's talk about how we can find ways to kind of raise the money to do the story you're telling justice, not just do it as a one-person show, because that feels like the economic way to get it on the stage. So I'd love to see not less one-person shows, but that the one-person shows are there feel like they're justifying being a one-person show, that kind of formally, content-wise, and performance, that all kind of comes together and it feels valid to be a one-person show. Ooh, other questions. How do you negotiate a good deal at a venue, and what's a good deal and a bad deal? For anyone that hasn't been to the Fringe, I'll talk specifically about the Fringe. There's kind of 3 main deal structures at the Fringe. So 4 venues that kind of work as the EdFest partnership. So that's ourselves, Underbelly, Assembly, and Gilded Balloon, along with venues such as the Trav. I'm pretty sure Summer Hall work in this way as well. All work on splits. So the deal is relative, that split percentage may vary, but it's roughly a 60-40 split, 60% of the income going to the artist, 40% of the income going to the venue. And that is because it costs a huge amount to build venues in Edinburgh. When you build a theatre anywhere else, that theatre remains there. We have to kind of take down the 26 venues and build 26 venues every year. So there's no initial outlay that allows us to kind of then reduce the cost over the period of time. So it's like building a theatre, all 26 of them every year. If a venue really wants your work, they'll work with you to either help you increase your fundraising capability, help you increase your sale capability, or work with you on a deal structure that allows you to come to the Fringe. So, and I know that's pretty much true across all of those kind of 6 venues I mentioned. The next kind of type of deal structure at the Fringe is kind of you hire the slots. There's a fixed cost at a fixed time, which works really well for some people because they know exactly how much they're going to be spending. And again, there's always room to negotiate. I think in everything, there's no harm in asking the question of how the deal can be improved. Can the hire be reduced? Can there be different trigger points? I think having the confidence to ask that question is a skill to kind of learn and practice. And if the answer's no, the answer's no, and you make a decision based on whether you'd still be willing to take that slot. And the kind of third deal structure really at the Fringe is the free Fringe, which is growing in kind of the number of venues, and the way that it works also varies a little bit between all the different free Fringe venues. It has its kind of pros, which is that the overhead cost is really low. Some of the cons are it is more difficult to get audiences generally, not always. Specifically for theatre, it's quite hard on the free Fringe. But I know lots of companies that have had huge success doing the free Fringe with theatre shows. So it's not something to discount either, and it is there's less kind of immediate upfront cost and overhead on that. There are still kind of the core costs of the Fringe, so Fringe Society registration, etc. I'm overrunning, but I've gone on a tangent. So I don't know if there's any more kind of questions that anyone wants to specifically ask. I kind of had just a final kind of couple of top tips for anyone that's kind of trying to get their work programmed at festivals or venues, really, that I will share, which is kind of in our application forms, there's really only 4 questions. One of them is, what is the show about? And really tell us what the show's about. The amount of applications I get that are marketing copy and it's like goes on a journey of adventure and that will change them forever. I'm like, that's great, but tell me what the journey is and tell me what the change is. Similarly, we had a great show. If I hadn't, that luckily I saw, because in their application they'd written that kind of a generic marketing copy description of what the show is, and they said that there's a big twist at the end, but we're not telling you what the twist is. Like, when you're looking to get programmed, please tell the venue or the festival what the twist is, because often we might be programming because the twist is really good. So just remember that, like, programming emails, also when people are emailing in for slots in our venue at London, I'm always saying to them, like, just give me as much information. Like, don't give me the entire synopsis of the play, but give me a good, concise description about what the actual content of the show is. And tell me about you. And that's often a question where emerging artists say, well, I haven't worked with lots of other people, so it's really difficult for me to say I've done this in the past or worked here. And my response to that is, well, tell me who you're inspired by. Tell me who your work's similar to, or who influences what you make, so that I get a sense. It's also a really good tip for when you're thinking about your audience. So sometimes I try and boil down what the show is, who the audience for a theatre show is, by using comparisons. So, like, it's a show for people that like Mad Men and listen to Radiohead. And that gives kind of other kind of cultural references that allow you to get a sense of who that show's about or what that company's work's like. And then the final thing is, tell me about who it's for, which is that question about audience. Why I think I've spoken so much about kind of linking programming and linking making to a sense of who it is as an audience, of who the audience for that work is. Because ultimately, unlike other forms of art, like painting, it's the example I often use, you can paint a painting and it exists, and you can get pleasure from the act of having been the painter. But it's very difficult to make a theatre show and get pleasure from the act of making theatre if it's never presented in front of an audience. So remembering that this medium is live, it requires other people to be watching it for it to exist right from the beginning, and then being clear about who those people you'd like to see it, I think, is so important. Something we're really, really bad at in the arts. We're trying to make the art, but not thinking about who the art's for. I've got one more question over here on Facebook. How do you feel about artists bringing their long-running shows over from other Big 5 venues? Do you feel like people should stay in their lane, or is it good to move around and find new audiences every few years? Cool. There are a lot of shows at the Fringe that have run at the Fringe for a very long time. If there's still an audience for a show, I think keep bringing it back. But in Loyal Company, we've done for 3 years. Shows do switch between venues. So we lose shows to other venues that are really successful. We gain shows from other venues. If there's an audience for it, I think that's great. So yeah, as long as people still want to see a show, like, it takes so much effort to make a show that if you can keep touring it. One of the things I find really most kind of proud about our program at the Pleasance is that some of our shows stay around, tour around, travel internationally for years. And I think that's just proof that we're trying to find work that has mass appeal and is popular and knows its audience. So that the longer, like the amount of effort that goes into making a show, the more people that can see it, I think is not a bad thing. I think it's an interesting thing with the whole digital thing at the moment as well, about the amount of effort that goes into a show. And if we can find ways to not only have a live experience, but also have a different but similar digital experience for everything we make, that could be a really good thing that kind of comes out of lockdown. So I have overrun, and the people at the King's Head might get really angry at me. So I'm going to wrap up, but I'd really like to thank King's Head again for having me. I'd like to thank you all for joining and dealing with my kind of technical incompetence. And just if you do have any other questions, there's anything else you want to ask, you can email. I'm currently on furlough, so you can't email me at the Pleasance. I'm not technically working for the Pleasance. But you can probably the easiest way would be to find me on Twitter. So it's just Nick_Connaughton, and shoot me over any questions. Or if you want to kind of have a coffee and chat more about programming, I've got a lot of time on my hands at the moment, and I'm really happy to have people reach out and ask any questions you want to ask, even if that's read some marketing copy, and I'll tell you, and I'll give you my opinion on whether I think it's too much like a funding bid. But yeah, thank you all very much. Huge thanks to the King's Head, and enjoy the rest of your days.